Okay, I think we've begun. Yeah, okay. Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of our podcast. Today, I have with me Joe Harrigan and Sophia Dourou, and we'll be talking about the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on careers in journalism. So let me begin by asking the guests to introduce themselves. Joe, I'll come to you later because I sort of know you a bit more. So, Sophia, would you mind telling us a bit about your background in like journalism or education?
Yes, hi. I retrained later in life to be a journalist. I've done my NCTJ 2 years ago. And ever since, for the last 2 years, I've been working as a freelancer, but primarily reporting on the courts, which has had its own sets of challenges in the new normal. But yes, right now, my main hat is a court reporter.
And are you working for a publication now, or as you said,
It's an agency. So basically, we get the copy and then it gets reused by the papers, mostly by the papers.
like Reuters?
Yes.
Yeah.
Slightly more tabloidy papers than
Sure, sure,
Reuters.
sure. Sure. Yeah, but what I mean is the way Reuters isn't a newspaper; it's an agency.
Yeah, it's an
Yeah, okay,
agency.
okay. And Joe, would you mind telling us a bit about your background? I know you studied history, right, at the Montfort?
Yes, I did. I studied history, as you know, and as a postgrad as well. We met, of course. I then again trained for my NCTJ at the same time as Sophia, and after a while working in various jobs, including as a local council employee, I now work for a cluster of regionals in the northwest of England, largely in Greater Manchester and out into Lancashire as well, where we do mainly a collection of reporting on local issues and stories of that nature.
Yeah, and
Sorry, I realized I forgot to mention my degrees because not particularly relevant to what I'm doing right now. But
I've mentioned mine, so
yeah, exactly. I did visual culture, which is sort of like art and visual arts and design and all of that theory. And then I did media studies, which is more about media theory rather than the workings of the media.
Yeah, both of these disciplines are extremely hot in the US East Coast, right? Media studies, visual arts, like
Well,
universities.
I'm not American.
No, but I'm just saying because I know people who wanted to study visual arts or what's the other one, media studies at universities like the NYU or Cornell, like many other places on the US East Coast, and some of them are doing quite well. So it's just that I mean, it's very interesting to hear those same phrases again. So I'm guessing you studied those degrees in Greece?
No, I studied
Okay.
in the University of Brighton for my MA, and then Sussex for my
Okay.
Brighton for my BA and Sussex for my MA.
Right. All right. Okay. So coming back to the discussion, so when the lockdown began, so what month was it last year? It was March, wasn't it? I remember Joe had just moved to Manchester for his job at the what was it? The Lancashire Telegraph.
Yes, and Bolton News.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I remember we went to Wetherspoons, and that was what, March or February, and like within weeks, everything was closed down. So, so when the pandemic began, and again, I'm putting this question to Sophia first. How did it immediately affect your like work life?
Well, when it immediately began, the way it affected me is I didn't have work because I happened to be, by coincidence, off with a minor health issue when lockdown began. And then by the time I was well enough to go to work, I wasn't really offered any shifts because most of the courts were shut down. So the courts shut down and were only operating so all jury trials paused. And then magistrates' courts were open, but they were only operating certain kinds of cases. So like obviously emergency things like domestic violence, or obviously if somebody murders somebody, they're still going to appear in front of the court. But all of the Crown courts were closed. They were also dealing a lot with the COVID violations because there was this new set of Some of it was legislature, some of it was advice. So there were a lot of people going into court for moving away from their address without a valid reason, or having a party, or all of that. So initially they were shut. Then the courts gradually started reopening, but the problem was they had to adjust them to make them COVID secure, which is a very, which is a phrase that does a lot of work and, in my opinion, doesn't really correspond to the reality. But it meant that due to social distancing, there are fewer courts. Jury trials took a while to get started. It's just there was already a massive backlog of cases in the Crown Courts and the Magistrates' Courts, which, regardless of what politicians will say, has nothing to do with COVID. It was only exacerbated by COVID. It has to do with austerity and cuts to the justice system. So we're more or less back to some kind of normal now, but it still can be very challenging in a lot of ways to cover the courts, but also for the people who use them, whether defendants or victims or everybody.
So when you talked about shifts, like you not getting shifts at the beginning of the pandemic, were you talking about the agency that you were working for back then?
Yeah,
Not
yeah,
getting the shifts? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm, even though I work full time, I'm technically a freelancer. And I was that wonderful group of freelancers that fell through the cracks, because when I started, I had worked half of that tax year at PAYE. So I earned more money on PAYE than as a freelancer. So basically, I didn't get any Rishi Sunak, where's my money?
Sure. Yeah. Well, he is busy with the green seal affair. So Joe, how did the beginning of the pandemic affect you?
It was very different for me in my case, because I am and was then under contract. So I would still be working the same number of hours each day, the same number of days each week. And it would basically add up to about 35 hours a week, full working week. The problem was we were all employed to continue doing this. And yet once the initial kind of shock of lockdown had taken place, once the kind of dramatic announcements were made and all the changes came in, for a few weeks after that, there was very little going on. So we were all tasked with basically still covering this unfolding crisis, but all we could really do was just repeat what we already knew. All the events that had been cancelled, all the new regulations that had come in. And of course, breaking things still happen, unusual events still occur, but it was all wildly kind of, just, I don't know what the phrase is, it just, there was a sudden trailing off of events to be doing. We couldn't go out and go anywhere in person. All the normal kind of day-to-day events, like, I mean, Sophia mentions courts. I mean, many of our court cases were postponed or cancelled. The same with, I mean, a lot of what we do would revolve around council meetings and decisions. They were called off for the time being. Even very basic things like local carnivals and fetes and things would all be, picked into the long grass. It was shortly after that is I sort of took on the role where I'd spend a lot of my time reporting on local businesses, who again were at the start not doing very much, but then it became kind of gauging the challenges that they were facing. And a very interesting thing happened in the summer, where the word kind of went out that we were going to try and, as they put it, back local businesses and give them this great sort of positive...
Eat out to help out and all that?
Yeah, it was during that era. But the problem is that flew in the face of what people were experiencing on the ground. People didn't feel positive. Even when things were opening up again for the first time, a lot of people felt it was premature. A lot of people felt they weren't given the security or the support they needed. And the idea that you'd somehow build some kind of positive campaign around that was ludicrous, because it just wasn't what people felt. And I think you have to actually reflect the reality in these cases, which is what I tried to do. And I did that by speaking to people one-to-one, sort of allowing them the space to explain what they really feel and looking at people across different sectors. Now, this is a bit different from what Sophia does, because with me being on a permanent staff basis, you do get the opportunity to build kind of longer term relationships with people. I don't know if you can do that to the same extent with agencies. I've not really experienced that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, this is again a question to both of you. I remember speaking to Joe about this last year. So say you report sports, so you're a sports journalist.
There was none of that going on. They were furloughed for the first few months.
Yeah. So the thing is, I mean, you follow football, I know, and I do as well. So
Sorry.
there was a bit of time. There was a bit of time when like the football leagues were still going on. Like I remember there was an Atletico Liverpool fixture at Anfield, which was allowed, and later on it turned out to be quite controversial as to why that was allowed. But the thing is, when those news agencies were being hit by the lockdowns, by like various measures, but they're still sending out people to these stadiums, to like lots of other places to cover things like, say, sports events, which do need to be covered in person. Like you can't just be sitting in an office and like cover the match.
Yeah, when sports events were happening, they were sending people out to to cover them. Because like you say, that has to be done in person. You can't do that by distance. You can't just sit back at home and listen to coverage, because if there's no one at the ground, then there is no coverage, is there? But I think in those cases, of course, I mean, there were no fans in the stadiums, so they were able to do that safely without much difficulty.
But that was later, but at the beginning, they were allowing.
At the beginning, yeah, I mean, I'm fairly sure they did continue to go on that.
And Sophia, to rephrase this question slightly for your context, I remember, like, again, this is an American example, like when all these bogus lawsuits were happening in the US post the November election, a lot of those proceedings were being done online, and we could see the live feeds. So was it a similar, was it a similar experience in the UK?
So it's a bit tricky. So for the first thing, the main difference between the UK and the US is that in America, you can broadcast court proceedings, whereas here it's a crime, the 1925 Criminal Justice Act. But so some of the courts, it was a very patchy picture. Some of the courts had CVP links in order to, for some or all of the participants to appear online, but it was a matter of sometimes there wasn't the infrastructure. Other courts were reluctant to provide those links because I think because they paid for a certain amount of licenses. Also, the technology is very bad. A lot of the staff doesn't really have training in that technology. So even now, it's so variable court to court. So for instance, there is a court, Isleworth Crown Court, where the judge who is the head judge of that court has basically said that CVP links should be available as a matter of principle for every hearing that's not a trial. So basically, as a journalist, you can have those links, you can click on them and you can just join and you just put in your name, you know, blah, blah, Smith from such and such organization. But then other courts are very tricky. And then it's also, even when they are available, it's not ideal. I mean, it's good for safety reasons, but it's not ideal because very often there's sound issues. I have seen judges attempting to provide tech support because an interpreter wasn't able to log in. I mean, it's not quite at the level of, you know, the Zoomcat lawyer mishaps, but there's been, if you think about it, if you're a defendant and you're appearing and you're being sentenced via CVP, it's not ideal, is it? And obviously they can't do that for jury trials because jurors need to be able to gauge the evidence. They need to be able to see if somebody's telling the truth and that's not easy to do when you're just a tiny little square. So the short answer is it's complicated. It is happening, but it's very tricky. My agency kept sending people in person even at the beginning of March when basically everybody was coughing and, you know, nobody knew what was going on. I know that other agencies such as the Press Association and newspapers did not send reporters in person. They do now. So yeah, it's still going on. There's still links, which can be good because if I have to go to Uxbridge Magistrates Court, which is like right before Heathrow for a 5-minute hearing, if I can just log in and get the basic, somebody's stating their plea or they're setting a trial, then that's good. But sorry, I could go on and on. It's a very tricky status, and they are looking at extending CVP links beyond the pandemic. The concern is that they might use this to even further downsize the courts and just have a bunch of Skype meetings, and that's not good for the justice system.
Sure.
Well, this kind of links into a point I was going to make, which is you wonder how many of the changes that the pandemic has enforced will end up becoming permanent. Like you mentioned the system of the courts there. I mean, the same principle can be applied to a lot of regionals where they've basically discovered that it is easy enough to do it remotely, or it's easy, but it's maybe not optimal. So an example of that is, I don't know if we know about, the familiar with Reach PLC, which owns a lot of the regional papers around the country. So they own, it tends to be like the big ones, Manchester Evening News, Liverpool Echo, Sheffield Star, I think, amongst others. And they've recently announced that many of their smaller titles will go to permanent home working, or in some cases based out of the offices of bigger regionals. An example I know very well, the Leicester Mercury, the local paper near where I grew up, who are now going to be based from Nottingham. And yeah, exactly. And so you can see how that makes a sort of sense to begin with in terms of they're forced into doing it, and it may seem more efficient, but a lot of local particularity, if you like, is missed out. And
Exactly.
you know, a lot
how are you supposed to report on a community if you're not actually in the community?
If you're not in the community, yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I've been doing for the past year almost, to a large extent. But the problem is, what I worry is that they've sort of discovered that they can do it to an extent. So when they're sort of thinking about costs and the sort of profit margins, what have you, then the incentive sort of creeps in when you think, well, why don't we just continue doing that?
Sure, but this is the antithesis of the very like raison d'etre of these papers' existence.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, the idea of a newspaper covering Leicester being based in Nottingham seems ludicrous.
No, and also like what seems to be happening here is, well, acknowledging the fact that Nottingham is probably a more serious town than Leicester. So, and it's not that. Well, I went to Leicester Uni, so I mean, it is my hometown in a way as well. No, what I'm trying to say is, so Nottingham has more population, maybe, well, Leicester minus Oadby is nothing, right? More or less.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, so if a paper that is supposed to be covering Leicester moves to Nottingham, then it is maybe a couple of steps away from some paper that is supposed to cover, I don't know, Birmingham, a big city, moving to London. And that is the antithesis of what people go on about, like the news in the UK being very London-centric, being very London-run and all that.
I mean, there are some kind of efforts being made to address that. I mean, I don't know if you saw the news a while ago about parts of the BBC being moved to Salford. And
Sure. Yeah. And Leeds has Channel 4 now, I think.
Yeah, well, it has bits of Channel 4. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I mean, there is that, but still, it would be great if cities that are not classified as quote unquote big cities or big towns, like get their share as well. Let me come to a different question now. So, like, forgive me if it's a silly question. It probably is. And I can tell from experience that when I was writing up my PhD thesis last year during the lockdown, I benefited a lot from the fact that I didn't have any distractions, that I could just sit in my apartment and like do research. And I think it affected the quality of my output. So do you think something similar happened to journalists as well? Like, say, for example, when you were having a lot of, let's say, well, for want of a better phrase, alone time to reflect on the quality of your work, did it lead to an improvement in the quality of your output eventually?
Sorry, I don't know, do you want to go first, Sophia?
Yes, Sophia can go first, yeah.
Well, I also do some online shifts from home. It really varies because it depends on your living conditions as well. So if my delightful neighbors upstairs, little bundles of joy, are running around and screaming, it's not exactly an ideal work environment. And also in terms of, yes, you get alone time, but we were in the middle of an unknown unprecedented pandemic. I don't know about you, especially after the New York Times put all of their coronavirus content outside of the paywall. I ended up
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah,
just doom scrolling, just
that's a
reading,
very good point. Yeah.
doing the whole armchair epidemiologist. I remember back in April last year reading about long COVID and people, young people in their 30s and 40s getting strokes after getting COVID and just getting, I mean, I can be a bit of an anxious person naturally, but I don't think it's anxiety when it's a once in 100 years pandemic. And it's not going to, the next one is not going to be in 100 years. I mean, that's been established. It's going to happen within 20 years.
No,
So
I mean,
yeah, sorry, I just,
Well,
it's,
it just, you sort of led me to a point I was going to make, which is that you talk about people having their alone time, and that may improve the quality of their work, but it doesn't really work like that, because of course in this industry, you've always got to be plugged into social media and plugged into breaking news and new developments. And I accept, I mean, you probably think I'm the last person who can credibly make this point, but for a lot of people, social media has driven them a bit strange over the past year, because it's been their only outlet into the world. And it's been, I think it's given a lot of people a quite distorted sense of
sure.
the wider world, if you like. And you can still watch
Alison Pearson would be one of them.
Still Alison. Apparently, many years ago, she was a fairly, sensible, sort of fairly run-of-the-mill commentator.
Well, many years ago, Simon Jenkins edited the Times. So. No, yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Many years ago, Peter Hitchens was in the Socialist Workers' Party. So,
Sure,
What?
sure.
no, he was. Yeah. He was. Yeah, look it up.
I've met him actually once in court. There was some lockdown deniers, and he was there to provide positive coverage for one of them. But
Okay.
when he told me who he was, I was just very grateful I was wearing a mask so he couldn't see my expression.
Right. No, yeah, sorry. What were we talking about?
People going strange.
Yes, basically, yeah. You can see my point though, that in certain people you can watch it happen in real time, which is that they've sort of, I think isolation has played a part in it. It's become their only outlet into the world, and so they've sort of become drawn into that sort of mixture of doom scrolling and also quite the way they can pursue quite strange theories and quite strange ideas down rabbit holes.
Well, it's like QAnon. It's the amount of people that have become radicalized into what can only be accurately be described as a religion rather than a conspiracy theory. I was reading this article about how evangelicals in the US are freaking out, evangelical pastors, because their flock are leaving the church for QAnon. And it's like, oh, so you train people to be angry and frightened, and now they have something else to be angry and frightened at.
Well, I'm convinced that couldn't have happened to the extent it has done without the added factors of isolation and the general climate of the pandemic.
But also, to be honest, again, going on a slight tangent here, I don't think Trump would have been defeated at the polls had it not been for COVID.
Possibly not, no.
Yeah.
No,
so anyway, one other thing I wanted to bring up here is science journalism. And well, Joe, I know you studied history, and Sophia, you said you studied visual arts and media studies. So I'm guessing it's fair to say that neither of you come from let's say a science background, you maybe studied science at sixth form colleges or university.
Well,
or schools.
My secondary school transformed into a science specialist college after full time there. That wasn't a particularly good decision from my point of view.
Yes.
Well, my secondary school, I had a chemistry and biology elective track, but it's been so many years, I've probably forgotten all of that.
Yeah, so the thing that I've tried to say here is, it seemed to me from the beginning of the pandemic until now that there is a real crisis in science journalism, and that crisis has actually always been there, but it is more in the face now because there are all these journalists who are having to report on what the quote unquote the scientists are saying, and you can see them saying absolute rubbish. I mean, you can see them saying things that don't make sense because they seem to be treating the scientists as a homogeneous community and lots of other. And it seems to me that there is no way out. I mean, you can't have scientists or people educated in the sciences being incentivized into joining journalism. So what you're gonna have is journalists being journalists. But I know one person called David Spiegelhalter. He gave a talk at Manchester, and he is actually a statistician based at the University of Oxford. And his role is, I think he's a professor of, what is the word? The public understanding of science or whatever. So he is always out there, like on BBC Radio or writing in The Guardian about why people shouldn't be worried about this statistic or that statistic, but it's just him. And when it's, yeah, sorry. What?
I'm gonna challenge you a bit on that. I mean, yes, there's like an absolute shower of rubbish that's coming from everywhere, but I would say that the dedicated health correspondents of serious publications have been very good. The problem is that some numbers come out and suddenly you have a bunch of general track journalists in possibly an online publication where they have to churn out 8 to 13 pieces of content a day, and they just pick up something and they tell you, and you have to lead on that. And that's why for certain subjects you should specialize. I wouldn't go and try to write a complex financial journalism piece because I don't really understand it. I can say if somebody's been appointed to the head of Bank of England, but that's the extent of it. So I think the problem is that every publication tries to do everything. So if you're, say, Metro Online, and you're trying to do celebrity gossip and hard news and terrorism and all of that, just the people, and there's no time to properly research a piece. I mean, I've interviewed for Online Shift Again, I've interviewed academics, and I was just thinking, oh my God, what they're saying is actually really interesting. I wish I had a couple of days to actually go through what this professor said and actually try to work out what it means. But no, because you have a deadline, you kind of have to get a couple of snappy quotes and hope that you pick the best ones.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, what I read, I didn't get that impression really. There were some very excellent health correspondents, absolutely. But there were also some people who were doing their best. Again, health correspondents doing their best. But it's just that the situation was unprecedented in so many ways that they couldn't help but be at fault. For example, I remember when the Lancet last year, and again, in medical science, research getting published is always a time-consuming process, like it has to be, because it is an evidence-based science rather than a proof-based science, the way, let's say, philosophy is or pure mathematics is. So there was this research published, I think it talked about how remdesivir, the drug that Trump was pushing early last year. Hydroxychloroquine? Yeah. Something like that. I mean, it is still not clear as to whether or not it should be considered a go-to drug for COVID, but it is used in some cases and not used in some cases. So the thing is, the Lancet published a piece saying they were like endorsing it or like not endorsing it, and then they retracted. Then they like took it back. And all of us, like as in people who are in the sciences, and I was talking to a lot of professors at Manchester as well back then, like statistics people, and we were all under the impression that this is too soon. How can they publish a paper this early and then retract it, take it back this early? And they were all like, the whole publishing industry, academic publishing industry in the sciences, especially in this case, medical science, is a different beast on its own. And I don't think someone who is trained to do journalism on science or on health will be qualified to tackle it. And that my point is, they shouldn't be qualified to tackle it, because they aren't supposed to be like talking about whether or not a referee took more time than usual, or whether or not someone who wrote a paper wasn't very courteous to the people that they cited. But with this pandemic upon us, there was a lot of pressure on people to report on such minutiae, I think, and that maybe put them at fault in some cases.
Well, as you said, to a certain extent, they can't help but be at fault, because you'd see these reports, and like you say, they go through processes of peer reviews, all sorts of different stages. Whereas the health correspondent who's covering the report has to turn something around in a matter of hours.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's impossible you'd have that level of
yes, a lose-lose. It's a lose-lose situation for them. Yeah.
I mean, there's a similar. Sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead.
A similar syndrome, strangely, came with the release of the government's race report recently.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know if you saw it, where they released this report that they'd commissioned from people who they hoped were going to find exactly what they did find about. Apparently, race plays less of a part than class or economic status in discrimination. And that was reported across a number of different outlets as this sort of indication, look, the UK isn't racist after all. And it was only one columnist I saw, Aditya Chakraborty in The Guardian, who actually chased down the sources.
Sorry? Divya Chakraborty?
Yeah, Aditya Chakraborty.
Aditya Chakraborty. Okay, sure,
yeah,
sure.
in The Guardian.
Yeah.
Who actually chased down the sources behind this report and the background of the people involved, the methodology used, etc. And he had clearly been given a very long period of time to do this, and had the expertise and the know-how, and the will to do it as well, which very clearly other people covering it have not had. And I think the same principle, if we go back to the start of the pandemic, applied when it came to reporting on the reports of publications like The Lancet, except they, of course, didn't have the time or the space or possibly.
They couldn't have had the time. That's the thing. They couldn't have had the time.
And maybe, in certain cases, didn't have the will to properly scrutinize these things either.
Yeah, sorry, Sophia, you were saying something.
No, I was just going to say it's a bit like the problem on reporting on Trump. If you're quoting a government source that might not be necessarily be coming from a place of honesty, and you're just repeating it, even if you say says Prime Minister or says President Trump, there's a certain amount of responsibility that you need to have. So it's like the
hydroxychloroquine. Yeah.
Hydroxychloroquine. Yeah, there we go. I think some of the instinct might have been because Trump was spewing such aggressive misinformation that they might have been reactive to it. But something like the race report, I mean, come on, just claiming that any country has zero racism, it's just ridiculous. Is this some kind of magical? I mean, just the fact that a man who wrote some really racially insensitive, to put it mildly, columns in the past as prime minister, maybe is giving you the indication that maybe not all is not well by itself. But yeah, it's just uncritically repeating what authority says, whether it's a politician, whether it's the police, whether it's just, there needs to be a bit of it needs to be challenged.
Right.
It needs to be put into this proper context. And I think very often the headlines are very simplistic and
sure. I remember who is this? She writes for The Guardian. I forgot her name. Sonia Sola? No, not Sonia Sola. So she was writing about, so this was back when Malala Yousafzai had just joined Oxford for an undergraduate course, must have been PBE, whatnot, what else would it be? So, and there was a fake picture of her going around the internet, which showed her wearing jeans. Apparently it's a big thing. And it was then found out that it was a fake picture. And then this person wrote a column for The Guardian saying, Malala Yousafzai has never been seen in public without a headscarf. And I wrote in the comment section, you do know that that's not a headscarf, right? Like what she is wearing is a dupatta. Like Joe might know, like you've worked more around Gujarati people than I have. So like there are, like in some cultures in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, women wear something on their head, which is not as, let's say, which is not as conservative in its history as the headscarf. So they would just put it on for say 2 minutes and then they could take it off or things like that, which you don't usually do with a headscarf. And that's exactly what Malala Yousafzai was on her head. And I wrote it, and she replied to my comment saying, yes, I do know that, but I wasn't given enough column space to explain that. So I had to just go with it. And there have been lots of instances where I've called out people on misleading headlines, like lots, as in maybe 3 or 4.
Well, they
have told me that. Yeah, and they have told me that they don't decide on the headline; someone else does.
Oh no, they don't.
Yeah.
So,
club editors are the most feared people in the industry. They can change the entire tone of an article the odd choice of words.
Yeah, one thing, since both of you have had experience working in agencies, I wanted to just know from you. So we were talking about science journalism. I have seen this a lot. Say some paper gets published somewhere, and there is a report, say in the Washington Post or in the New York Times, describing the paper, and a certain kind of phraseology gets used in the report, and then every other report in the English language media world that talks about that report, every other news article that talks about that report uses exact same kind of phraseology. So what happens there? Is it just good old plagiarism, or is it one agency that first did the reporting that used the phrases and then everyone kept
so an example of the phraseology would be what sort of thing you're thinking of?
Well, I don't know. Say you're talking about race reports. So say, can you hear us now?
Yeah. I think I know what you mean. It's not necessarily it's plagiarism if you lift a bunch of a lot of lines or quotes from the article, but you can't say, as reported in the Washington Post. I would probably say, I mean, I haven't actually written copy based on something the New York Times said, but I would probably say that because they are papers of record and are generally respected, and the people who are rewriting it are just churning out quick copy, it's probably safer research the original paper. They don't have time. They have to churn out however many pieces of copy. So they just picking up the main bit and then maybe getting an extra quote or whatever to flesh it out a bit. But it's just a sad illustration of how online has really eroded the quality of journalism in a lot of cases. You just don't have time. We just don't have time.
Well, there's kind of two pressures there. One is time, which is the obvious one. And also a lot of them will be working with individual targets, as in you must get X number of page views per month.
Okay.
Again, that does warp a lot of people's priorities, I mean, there's times when you know that something that you could work genuinely hard on that you think is genuinely worth doing, but would take you half a day or an entire day, would be sort of placed on the back burner because you think, well, just bash out, 5 bits of rewritten agency copy instead. Not get more quick.
What is the like best way forward then for these people? Like, do they just have to be very, very well learned, and like because, for example, say you are being asked to write write not 1,000 words, like however many words on a foreign policy announcement of, say, Biden's or someone like that. And say with the history background, you can check some of the things that he has said. You can like maybe have a quick look through some of your books, and you can like compose your piece that way. But of course, if someone who is not from a history background, I don't know, if someone who studied Spanish at university and then went into journalism, if someone like that is being asked to write the same piece, maybe they wouldn't have the background to, or the will to do all that, right?
Possibly not, no. And again, it's where if you've got a grounding in the humanities, it does help because it gives you a certain kind of background knowledge in these sort of cases. I mean, a very good example that I know very well, and you won't be surprised in bringing this up, is the recent minor street disturbances in Belfast. I'm calling them the minor street disturbances in Belfast because I know that they're an absolute pinprick compared to what used to happen in the old days.
Sure.
It's a resumption of large-scale conflict. And people who say it is are following certain agendas. And in many cases, they just genuinely don't know because they see dramatic images of buses burning and people throwing Molotov cocktails, but they don't really know the social dynamics in play in any great detail.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so
it's frustrating when you see people getting it wrong, but I think to myself, well, if I know that this isn't right here, then presumably people with more kind of in-depth knowledge of various other subjects will be thinking the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. That's true. And Sophia, would you agree?
I mean, I as somebody who has seen the great financial crisis covered by international news outlets, let's just say I get the the rage at seeing people getting it so painfully wrong. I mean, I don't necessarily think a journalist needs to be learned in every single area in order to be to cover the subject. I mean, we all going to have gaps in our knowledge unless you become super specialized. But I would say, especially when you're doing opinion, that is when staying in your lane is very important. So if you
Exactly.
don't really know something, but if you're doing more of a straightforward news coverage, or you're trying to do a feature and you're trying to understand a topic you don't necessarily understand, I think being able to listen and to ask questions to get to some kind of truth. So experts are very useful in that sense. I mean, I've interviewed quite a few academics, and they're generally quite happy to talk to journalists. Either they ignore you or they just will get back to you pretty soon. So, I mean, obviously not all academics agree on every subject, but I think just interviewing a couple of people on a subject, you get a more rounded opinion. It might not be the objective truth, but you're not going to be talking out of your arse quite as much. Can we swear here?
Yeah, sure.
I should have checked that really.
Yeah. So I think people, the whole online content farming thing is not ideal for journalism, but even with some limitations on time, because not everybody can be an investigative journalist who can work on 6 months on a story. Even with some constraints in time, I think you can try to ask the right questions, try to ask the right people, and also not try to come up with an opinion just because you're
that's a very good point. Since you mentioned investigative journalists, I remember reading Ronan Farrow's piece, on the original piece on Harvey Weinstein, which came out in November 2017, I believe, in the New Yorker. It was a very long piece, very well researched, extremely well researched. But I feel personally that like Farrow sort of, I don't know, become a little bit full of himself later on, like in his other kinds of journalism. For example, he wrote a book on diplomacy, which I read. I can't remember if I finished it, but it was very bland. There was like really nothing in it. Like one could have written that book based on news reports. I think it was called War and Peace, maybe War in Peace, something like that. Like, and so I mean, so that it is possible, of course, that one could be extremely good at one kind of journalism or one kind of topics and be not so good at others. And also, I mean, since you were just talking about opinion pieces, the kind of pieces that I enjoy the most are, health correspondents, for example, art critics. So Jonathan Jones, I enjoy him a lot. And there was another very famous film critic who used to write for The Telegraph. His name is escaping me right now. And yeah, so like these people, they get a lot of time to research or to like look into things for their pieces, which they maybe churn out once a week, and that helps them. Yeah, sorry, Joe.
Well, I was going to add that on the staying in your lane opinion piece topic, I think, again, this links back to the economy of social media, where it's sort of pressure on particular opinion writers to basically come out with some take about anything that happens. That anything that's going on in the news, they've got to bash something out, even if it's just a tweet or something. They've got to look at it. And often, of course, it's just something that they've just come up with off the top of their heads that's nonsensical in some cases. And you think to yourself, well, why? You clearly don't know what this is about. Why do you feel the need to tell us what you think here? But the answer is that there is kind of, like I say, the economy of social media sort of demands that they do it.
Right.
Because that's make their living, essentially.
And do you think the lockdowns sort of made that problem worse?
Yes.
Why?
Well, because there's an awful lot of things, huge events are impacting people's day-to-day lives happening, but also because, again, it sort of chains people to the virtual world to an extent, where it feels like these things are happening all about them and they've got to participate in it.
Right.
They've got to have this.
Sorry, I interrupted. There's also a practical aspect that a lot of newsrooms have shut down. A lot of journalists have been let go. A lot of so suddenly you have a lot of journalists out of work who are possibly trying to freelance and trying to pitch pieces. At the same time, commissioning budgets have been slashed. So it's all but desperate right now, to be honest. And it's as to the point, again, too much time on social media seems to have radicalized people in various ways. I mean, there seem to be several certain columnists on papers that shall remain nameless that seem intent on committing mass murder through bad health advice. So
why must they remain nameless?
because we're probably going into defamation territory if we accuse them of mass murder.
Okay.
Listen to the experts.
Sure.
We all know who we mean.
No, and also one other thing I wanted to bring up here is the foot soldiers of, let's say, tabloid journalism, like the paparazzi. So do you think, well, maybe I shouldn't call them foot soldiers, but like, do you think that they are still playing a major role in like getting scoops, or is it just taking pictures of, I don't know, who's taking pictures of people who have been on Love Island and things like that?
Well, a lot of it does seem to revolve around that. And again, that links you back to the clicks model, where they know what will get them online engagement, what will help their targets, increase ad revenues. So that's what they focus on. You can be Kevin Carter and, take your famous picture of the Vietnam War and win your Pulitzer Prize, but you can't do that 5 times in a day to meet your targets.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, that was the picture of that girl running away from the Napalm bombing scene.
One,
yeah. No, the thing is, yeah. So for example, and okay, coming to Sophia now. So
it's not fair to put him in the same category as the paparazzi. Sorry.
No, the freelance photographer. Let's stay there.
Well, my family is a freelance photographer as it goes. So.
Okay.
Well, we use quite a lot of photographers outside of court, obviously, because if you don't have a picture, you don't have a story, no matter how good the story is. But in terms of, because I do write agency copy, so I cover various things, but what actually makes, which is very little these days because COVID has sucked all the oxygen from the room. It's starting to calm down a bit. But you might have a very sad, very tragic story, but the reality is, or something that tells you something about the systemic failure of the justice system. But the reality is the stories that are going to make is if the defendant or the victim live in a fancy postcode, if there's some minor celebrity connection. I mean, obviously the really big murder trials, terror, that always makes, but in terms of the day-to-day stuff that you encounter, it's just, there's a certain appetite for only certain types of stories. So,
and why do you think that is the case? Is that because that's what they have been fed for the past couple of decades?
Yeah, I've had this debate on I've had this debate with my colleagues actually, because they're saying that, oh, the British public wants that, and does the British public want that, or has the British public been trained to want that? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but it's this country's absolute obsession with class. So they're obsessed with posh people, but they also like to see them be naughty and be brought down. It's also unfortunate that certain stories, if two defendants commit an original, an identical crime, there's going to be more of an appetite for the story if the defendant is not from a white English background. There's obviously any minor celebrity connection. I mean, I don't really understand celebrity culture as it is. I mean, I consume films and music, but I couldn't really care less about who showed up on a dating show. But yeah, no, when Carolina Flack died, that was quite interesting, because right prior to her death by suicide, there was an absolute obsession with getting all the salacious details and the media hounding her. And then obviously, sadly, she died by suicide. And then there was a immediate reverse ferret where they try to walk back their arguments and try to blame the CPS. And it's like, well, actually, you hounded her. I mean, suicide is very complex and we don't want to ascribe one motive, but yeah, it's just...
No, Carolina Flack is very recent. Like if we go back like a good deal of time, we can maybe even go back to Amy Winehouse. And of course, like maybe the media didn't play as active a part in her death per se, the way they did in Carolina Flack's death. But even then, like the way she used to be questioned on, like the kinds of questions that she used to get on like talk shows and stuff regarding her drug habits, maybe like damaged her mentally so much.
In that case, there was also a lot of collusion between the producers and her management, record label, etc. They knew publicity was good for their,
Okay, it seems like both of us have seen the same documentary. So
I still haven't. It's on my
Right.
list.
It's a very good documentary called Amy by Asif Kapadia. He's a very good filmmaker. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. So the thing that you're saying, I mean, I get it. Like celebrity culture is a mystery to me as it is to lots of other people. But the thing that I don't understand is, I mean, of course, there are some, for example, well, if you go over to the US, say, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, like it's a silly show. It has been a silly show for a very, very long time. But the kind of revenues they generate, like, could an argument be made that the kind of revenues a show like Keeping Up with the Kardashians might generate can be used by, what is the network there, HBO? Like can be used by HBO to, I don't know, fund a documentary or something.
Thing is, I mean, going back to what we were saying about whether people are being conditioned to want what they apparently want, I think it's important to remember it wasn't ever thus. Mm-hmm. If you go back to sort of British public service broadcasting in the 60s and 70s, you would see incredibly what we would consider highbrow series, documentaries and drama and comedies even. A series like Kenneth Clark's Civilization, rather, which is impossible to imagine that being broadcast in prime time on BBC One these days. You could imagine BBC Four or something like that, but not on
BBC One, yeah.
Prime time. Bronowski's The Ascent of Man, The World at War, which I think was on ITV. Again, very well-worn topic, the Second World War, but you couldn't imagine the series now going into that level of depth and allowing the sort of more complicated arguments to come to the fore. And strangely, in a way, the fact that they had this monopoly is what helped them. It meant that they had an audience and they thought, well, we'll present it to them and they'll take it or leave it. But in the end, many of them took it. So it is possible, I think, to raise the bar somewhat. I mean,
if we're talking strictly in terms of TV, with the advent of streaming services, I mean, first with Netflix, where they were allowed to do something like Orange is the New Black, which would have been unheard of on network TV previously. So there is a certain dumbing down because you have all the your Love Islands and your various silly shows, but then you have things like Chernobyl, which was a phenomenal miniseries, or even
HBO.
Yeah, I believe so. Or even to put on my geeky hat on, stuff like WandaVision and Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which, yes, is silly, is comic book based, but it's also doing a lot of interesting things. You couldn't imagine the genre when you go back to the 1990s and see the made-for-TV movie with David Hasselhoff playing Nick Fury, which I still am trying to find.
Well, I mean, to go on a slight tangent here, I mean, I used to, I mean, of course, you have done media studies, so you will know these things much more than me. But I used to be a very avid film buff, like back when I was, before I started my PhD, before my PhD actually. But once I started my PhD, I couldn't really keep up with that habit. So I could see, for example, that with Netflix produced shows, like shows that are produced with Netflix money, over time, there seems to be this tendency towards producing the hit formulas from the 90s, like rom-coms, lots and lots of rom-coms. But I think there is maybe some things, all of the factors that we have been discussing in the past few minutes are obviously true and very prescient and there. But maybe there is also something about the human, not instinct, but maybe the kind of things that people usually or generally, or maybe universally feel comfortable watching. So for example, Netflix, Amazon Prime, these sorts of streaming services, I think will forever keep on trying to do good work. But at the same time, they will maybe over time keep try to churn out more and more, like just lazy hits. Yeah.
What? It's nothing. Do you know what? I'm going to defend rom-coms.
Okay.
Not that I personally am a fan, but I think especially right now, with the stress of the pandemic and everything, if people just want to turn their brain off and just enjoy.
No, I would defend them. I would defend them very much, and I would say, like sticking to films, that rom-coms have given us some very good actors. Like people like, maybe if you look at the kind of films John Cusack was doing before he started doing rom-coms, like no one even knew that he could act, but now he is decent. Well, Hugh Grant could be an example if one wants to pull out a British example. Like lots of other, like it's very like rom-coms done well, or rom-coms with decent plots. I mean, of course, UK, like people like Richard Curtis, like Richard Curtis would be like a very big example here. Like he wrote Mr. Bean. He also wrote like, I don't know, Notting Hill, Love Actually. This sorts of films.
Before that.
Sorry, what?
Blackadder before that in the 80s.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was it Richard
sure
Curtis? Yeah, could have been. Yeah, could have been.
I've never watched Blackadder.
Oh, you should. It's very, very good. I mean, just now when Joe was mentioning shows from back then, of course, Blackadder is not that old. I thought you would mention Not the 9 O'Clock News or Yes, Minister.
Again, I mean, I did say it's reflected in comedy as well that there was this assumption that people could handle stuff that was a bit more complex, a bit more controversial in some cases.
Yeah, that's quite true. Okay, one new question that maybe we could discuss for the remaining few minutes is how to, so like regarding promotion in the journalistic world. I remember speaking with Joe about who was that guy again? Jason Burke? Was it Jason Burke?
Oh yeah, the 9/11 wars, yeah.
And yeah. So Jason Burke, he wrote this very, very excellent book, I would say. Well, actually, Don Chomsky agrees with me, or rather, I agree with him regarding the merit of this book called The 9/11 Wars. And he's a very decent journalist. He's very well learned on whatever he writes upon. But he started his career as, I mean, he worked with the Sunday Times, right? Like back when he started, and it was at a fairly low-level job, and then he worked his way upwards. So my question is, with say COVID, some sort of COVID reality remains with us for, I don't know, a couple of more years, let's say. So do you think that would stunt the, let's say, improvement curves of many young journalists, like say you two?
That's very hard to say because I really don't know what the long-term fallout will be. I think it will change the landscape quite substantially. I mean, yeah, my instinct is to be a bit cautious. But, I wouldn't say optimistic, but I'll try to be. But I don't know. It's very hard to say at this point. I think one thing that could be a positive is that if we do see a more kind of diverse landscape, which kind of, but even then, I mean, I talk about diversity, but then if you're online only and you're largely relying on the click model that we talked about earlier, so I don't know. I think there's opportunities there, but I wouldn't be ready to make any predictions there yet.
And Sophia?
I mean, I'm rather on the pessimistic side. I mean, just the fact that so many good newsrooms have shut down. I mean, the UK BuzzFeed
I think the
Huffington
Post thing. I was
Huffington Post. Huffington Post, yeah.
Huffington Post most recently, and just a lot of people being let go. Yeah. It's just it's not a very good image. I mean, hopefully there's been conversations happening, particularly about diversity in media, and in terms of diversity, both ethnic diversity, class diversity. I don't want to say diversity of opinion because that makes it sound like I'm some angry right-winger talking about why can't I? Well, that's that's a whole right-wing talking point. Diversity of opinion.
It's sort of spike-esque when you talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, I should be allowed to be as as bigoted as I want because it's diversity of opinion.
Okay,
some opinions are just bad.
Well, the thing is, there's a wider issue there, which is that BuzzFeed have for a number of years been pursuing a model where they've basically been trying to prevent unionization drives. I think it was last year or the year before where there was an attempt to unionize the staff of BuzzFeed, and that was rejected. And shortly afterwards, it was cut quite significantly. A lot of them put on short-term contracts. And the same things happened with the Huffington Post. I mean, that was very well run, and there's a lot of very good people there. But ultimately for BuzzFeed, since they took it over, it's cheaper for them to, gut it and transform it into yet another click farm. I mean, I hope it didn't turn out like that, but...
well, The Independent used to be a very successful very successful publication in print journalism. And when was it, 2016 or 2015, that they went completely online. So how are they doing? Like,
they still do a lot of good and worthwhile work.
Oh yeah, no, their Home Affairs correspondent Lizzie Dearden, I've met her a bunch of times in court, and she obviously does some really good work, especially investigating the far right. So there are still good journalists working there, but there's also a lot of there's also a lot of pressure to churn out content.
Yeah, to an
so
extent, you have to sort of
bag.
allow it in some cases where you think, well, okay, they're going to churn out X amount of, clickbait and listicles.
No, they do. Yeah, they do.
They do. I know they do.
Yeah.
I do follow them. I see what they post. But at the end of the day, if they do that and it allows them to pay the bills and to actually do some good, worthwhile work as well, then to an extent, you have to say, well, okay then.
Yeah, but this is analogous to what I was saying earlier about HBO taking the money that they're making from Keeping Up with the Kardashians and
I think
using
HBO is funded by subscribers, isn't it? Or,
their parent company is AT&T, right?
I
think so. And these things are so complicated. Like, what was it? Asda and Sainsbury's are now this. There was a merger or something.
No, Asda is owned by Euro Garages now.
Yeah, like these things are so. Like Walmart owns
They
Asda.
used to own Asda. They've now sold it to.
Okay. And there was something similar with, was it Travelodge and like these things are so like sometimes so non-trivial and so bizarre. Okay, maybe we can have one last little discussion before ending. So how do you think people can improve from, well, people as in journalists or people who want to be in that field, how do you think they can improve from the experiences of COVID, do you think? Like if say, I don't know, you have a younger brother or I don't know, something like that, someone like that who looks up to you and does or wants to do exactly what you do, and what would you tell him or her about like entering this field in like with COVID as the like present reality? We can start with Sophia and then we can continue.
I'm getting some sound issues again.
Okay, I'll try and think of something for you. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. I think actually, I mean, to an extent, willingness to take on board criticism is important. I mean, obviously, a lot of it just devolves into online slanging matches and what have you, but there are valid points to be made, and I think listening to that is important. I mean, we just now have been quite willing to be critical of large sections of the industry, and I think that's important to be realistic about it, to accept where the flaws are and why people take issue with them, and be open to different ways of addressing that. I think that's a very important thing. And in a way, COVID has brought all of that into sharper focus. The issues we talked about today, I mean, the lack of expertise in some areas, the need for people who focus on opinions to stay in their lanes, we've said.
Or to expand their expertise by reading more.
Or expand their expertise, yeah, if they're willing to do that, that's fine. And yeah, the issues we talked about with the click economy and the tendency of social media to drive people mad. That was all there before, but it's been exacerbated by COVID, no doubt. So yeah, I would say to be conscious of these things and to be open to people's suggestions about how you deal with them.
Yeah, that's and Sophia, would you like to add something?
I think those are all good points. I would also say that hopefully people have come out of this with a little bit more compassion for others, because if you find yourself being furloughed or losing your job or having the fear of getting seriously ill or dying might make you more compassionate towards people who live with complex disabilities. And just everything that has happened in the world, all of the upheaval, it's kind of shown both the best and worst of people, this pandemic. And coming out of it, you kind of have to make choices on where you stand. And that's not just in terms of journalism, that's just in terms of outlook in life.
Yeah, and also the thing that often bothers me is the level or standard of language that gets used in, let's say, daily publications. I seem to think that there's been, like over the years, there's been a fall in that standard. So, like, I don't want, like, no one wants Shakespearean English in, I don't know, in a Daily Mail column, of course. But the thing is, maybe with more reading, like the thing that I was talking about earlier, with science journalism, like some agency, some newspaper writes something, and then every newspaper in the world, even when they're citing that original paper, original piece, they're just using the same kinds of phrases. Maybe if people knew more words or knew more ways of writing things or phrasing things, because they're supposed to be good at this, right? Because I see people who are very good at this sometimes. Like, for example, there was this EU correspondent at the Telegraph, Peter Foster. he used to be very good at, like, because he used to pander to, like, for the, I don't know, for the last 3-4 years of his Telegraph career, he used to pander to the Eurosceptic wing of the, let's say, wing of the Telegraph readership. But still, he was quite Europhile in his outlook. But he used to still do quite well because he knew how to. Well, actually, he I think mastered that art by first being good at writing Twitter threads. Yeah. Okay.
The real skill of journalism today. The
Yeah.
Twitter thread.
Before we end,
Just
Twitter
do like
threads.
me and
Yeah, Twitter
posting
threads. Can both of you say something about the future of the art form of Twitter thread?
just do like me and just post increasingly sort of surreal in-jokes that only make sense to fewer and fewer people until eventually you're the only one who really knows what you're on about.
But do you think they can serve a purpose?
That's a difficult question.
If your Twitter thread is like 60 tweets, put that in an article. I mean, yes, they can serve a purpose, but not everything needs to be an elaborate Twitter thread, and not everyone is equally
Patient.
as good
Okay,
at this.
that's good.
Yeah, it's an art form. It's unfortunate actually because
yeah, it's like the graffiti. It's like, yeah.
Being good on Twitter is almost like prerequisite to get a job these days, especially if you're starting out. And there's obviously very good journalists that are terrible at Twitter. If you look at a lot of the older journalists who might be old school journos, you look at their Twitter and it's like, you know, your mom updating her Facebook. And then there's a lot of people who are very good at Twitter, but that doesn't mean they're journalists. They're just good at shit posting.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. No, also, you remember when was that? Colin Rooney v. Rebecca Vardy.
Oh yes. Yes.
When was it? A couple of years back, right?
So was that?
When did that happen? When was it affair?
2019, I think.
2019, yeah. So what? Who was it? It was Colleen posting, right? Like she said, so someone was leaking. Someone was leaking.
I'd like to point out that the High Court defamation case for those two, which I haven't personally covered, but I know others that have, is referred to as Wagatha Christie.
Yeah.
Okay, is that the official? Okay.
Well, not the official court case. It's
no. I know. Lots of people.
That's how it's being referred to, including by some very serious court reporter types.
To be fair, I mean, Colleen's investigative skills, I mean, she took me by surprise with that. I never would have guessed it.
And the way she did the whole X Factor.
Well, I mean,
like, and it was then in a separate tweet.
Well, I remember, I mean, someone pointed out, it was English academic, or as an English literature academic, pointed out that if you look at Colleen Rooney's statement, narratively, it was incredibly well structured. The way she follows like the classic plot structure. She introduces like the inciting incident.
Sure.
You know, we have the death of the hero and the eventual solution.
No, that was absolutely amazing. Yeah, absolutely amazing.
So we are landing on Colin is going to save journalism.
Yes.
Just put her in charge of the Times or something.
No, because no, I really liked it, and it's just that. I mean, the year I was at Leicester won the league, and things were absolutely mad over there. And like that's when I got to know about, you know, like Jamie Vardy, Rebecca Vardy, but Colleen Rooney. Like I remember when I was young, like when Wayne Rooney got married, and like it's like I have been following the WAG career of Colleen Rooney, and that was the highest point, her being that excellent investigative journalist. No, yeah, Twitter threads. Twitter threads are the. I mean, they're like what graffiti is to painting. They are exactly that thing to maybe, I don't know, writing opinion pieces or whatever. But sometimes they do work quite well, right? Sometimes people do read through 5 tweets and
well, like the problem is, again, I mean, it sounds a bit harsh to say the problem is anyone can do them. And sometimes you get threads that get a lot of online traction, which just are completely nonsensical. So there's, I don't know, they can have value in some cases. In other cases, they very much don't. And again, I mean, I've talked a lot about the attention economy here. There are times when people just post something that they know is ludicrous, but will just get them the attention that's just off the top of their heads.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Like that's why when I see there's been a Twitter thread which has been posted, like there's a Twitter thread
I
which
can
has been
scroll
posted
at
from
any given time and find you an example.
no, it's just that when I see that they have been posted from a computer and not an iPhone, we're like, okay, this person really wanted to post a thread. Like he or she sat in front of a computer and did it. But yeah, well, I mean, we did go through some interesting issues and points. Before we stop recording, Sophia, would you like to talk about your podcast?
Yes, so me and my fellow crime reporters have a podcast called Trial by Media. It's available on Apple and on Spotify, and we basically analyze some of the cases we've covered, some of the issues in the justice system. We talk COVID, murders, terrorism, all the good stuff. So check it out.
Yeah, that's great. So the trial by murder, is it? Sorry.
No, Trial by Media.
Trial by media. Trial by media.
It's good. I recommend it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. It's on Apple and Spotify. Is it also on Deezer? Have you heard of Deezer?
I don't think so. I guess my colleague is handling the churning out in the platforms. But
Oh, I see. You are the brain.
no, we're all the brains.
Okay.
Just some of us more technically minded than others.
Sure. Maybe we can stop recording now and we can maybe speak for a few minutes. And I do want to talk about what I earlier said I want to talk about. Okay.
Okay,
That's
cool.
Thanks.